وبركاته. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على سيدنا ونبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. In our lessons on Maraqi al-Falah, Sharh Nur al-Idah, we're continuing to look at the conditions of valid following of the Imam. And these can readily be summarized, right? Which is why it's so important to not just write out the text, but also to try to diagram it. Because when you diagram, you see, okay, these conditions are interrelated, right? How would I summarize it? So that's part of active learning, right? So you'll notice many of these conditions relate to the foundational condition, one of the foundational considerations, which is the follower has to have the same state or lesser than the Imam. And that has a number of implications, right? So he tells us, وَأَنْ لَا يَكُونَ الْإِمَامُ رَاكِبًا وَالْمُقْتَدِي رَاجِلًا, right? قال الإمام الشرنبلائي رحمه الله ويشترط أن لا يكون الإمام راكبا والمقتدي راجلا. From the conditions of validly following is for the Imam not to be riding like a horse or a car, and the follower standing. Because the one who's riding will be praying with head movements. The one standing on the ground will be praying with prostration, right? أو بالقلب, or the opposite. بالقلب أي العكس. أو راكبا دابة غير دابة إمامه, or for the Imam to be riding a different animal or car than the Imam, because you are effectively in a different place. لاختلاف المكان, right? حكما. وإذا كان على دابة إمامه صح الاقتداء لاتحاد المكان. But if one is riding the same mount or the same car as the Imam, this will be valid because you're both effectively in the same place. So the example of that would be, let's say there's a rainstorm. You're on a road trip and there's a rainstorm. So, and it's Saturday night, so you have to pray Maghrib, and you find a place to stop, but there's nowhere you can go indoors to pray. And it's pouring with rain. And there's two cars together. So could one car lead the other? No, they would need to do two jama'as because of what's mentioned here, right? Because each car is considered to be one place, so to speak, hukman. We'll see some of the fiqh of travel and praying on different modes of transportation when we get to it. But then the author says, وَيشْتَرَطْ أَنْ لَا يَكُونَ الْمُقْتَدِي فِي سَفِينَةٍ وَالْإِمَامُ فِي سَفِينَةٍ أُخْرَى. It's a condition that for valid following, that the follower not be in one boat and the Imam in another boat. غَيْرِ مُقْتَرِنَةٍ بِهَا, unless the two are connected, right? And we'll be seeing the fiqh of that. Right? And there's some discussion. What if the cars were right next to each other? So there would be some khilaf there as well. But we'll look at the details of that when we get to the section on praying when traveling. Okay. والرابع عشر من شروط صحة الاقتداء, the 14th of the conditions of sound following, أن لا يعلم المقتدي من حال إمامه المخالف لمذهبه مفسدا في زعم المأموم. يعني في مذهب المأموم كخروج دم سائل أو قيء يملأ الفم والتيقن أنه لم يعد بعده وضوءه. right? So here, this has to do with where you're praying behind someone of another madhab, right? People get very emotional, worked up, especially fiqh, right? Ilm cannot be pursued emotionally, right? Because emotions cloud reason, right? So, sometimes the Shaykh asks, so what do you like to study? I like studying. So what are you planning on studying? What you like. Why? Because I like it. They'll be like, what kind of person is that, right? Because that doesn't make sense, right? A person should be principled. So people give, how can't you pray behind a person of another madhab? Just understand things step by step. Now, what we know about moral responsibility, right? Moral responsibility, who are you? Like, there are 4 aspects to the ahkam al-shar'iyya. There's the hakim, the mahkum bihi, right? And the hukum, and the ruling, right? So the hakim, the legislator is Allah. The mahkum is you, right? And then there's the hukum, right? And what the hukum relates to. So there's the prayer, and what's the hukum of the prayer? The mahkum bihi is the salah, and the hukum is that it's fard, for example. Now, what is your moral responsibility? It's for yourself, right? Your moral responsibility is for yourself. What is a madhab? A madhab is a وسيلة اعتبرها الشارع صحيحة لمعرفة حكم الله تعالى. Right? A madhab is a means that the lawgiver has deemed correct to know what is the ruling of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That is a madhab. Right? Why? Because of the text related to following a madhab. فَاسْأَلُوا أَهْلَ الذِّكْرِ إِن كُنتُمْ لَا تَعْلَمُونَ. Ask the people of knowledge if you know not, etc. So if you follow a madhab, then, and you're judging by that madhab, how would you consider the prayer? Can I pray behind that imam? According to what you believe to be correct, right? So the imam has a bleeding nose. What's the ruling of a bleeding nose in the Hanafi madhab? What does it do to your wudu? Invalidates. So can I pray behind someone I believe doesn't have wudu? The basis is that no, because I don't think his prayer is valid, and I'm building my prayer on his, right? And for my prayer, it's my opinion that counts, right? The opinion of the madhab that I follow. The imam, there's some people who get nervous, they vomit. So they're going to lead a lot of people, they just vomited in front of you, and they're going to go pray. The basis is that I wouldn't pray in there. Why? Because of this issue, that the 14th condition for validly following is that the follower not know from the state of the imam that who's of another madhab, something that invalidates the prayer, right? Which would include the conditions of the prayer, right? According to the madhab of the follower, such as the exiting of flowing blood or a mouthful of vomit, if the Imam did not repeat their wudu after that. Right? Meaning, if you were not sure that the Imam you're sure that the Imam did not repeat their wudu after that. So he explains, حتى لو غاب بعد ما شاهد منه ذلك بقدر ما يعيد الوضوء ولم يعلم حاله فالصحيح جواز الاقتداء لكن مع الكراهة. But if the Imam disappears to the extent of the wudu and comes back, it's valid to follow, because the basis is that you interpret their actions to be sound. But if you don't have reason to believe they made wudu again, there will be some dislike regarding it. Right? Imam Tahtawi says this would be karahat tahrim. There's a lot of discussion about that. Just mahal bahth. That's not. Yeah. Right? كما لو جهل حاله بالمرة. Likewise, if you don't know their state at all. Right? Are they careful about the khilaf or not? أما إذا علم أنه لا يحتاط في مواضع الخلاف فلا يصح الاقتداء به. As for if you know for sure that the Imam is not careful in the issues of difference, then he says it's not valid to pray behind them. سواء علم حاله في خصوص ما يقتدي به فيه أو لا. Whether you know whether their state right now is sound or not. Now, يحتاط في مواضع الخلاف. So if you don't know, if you know that they're not precautious about the places of difference of opinion, Imam al-Shurmulari says, then it's not valid to pray behind them, whether you know their state in this specific prayer or not. وَإِنْ عَلِمَ أَنَّهُ يَحْتَاطُ فِي مَوْضِعِ الْخِلَافِ. And if you know that they're careful about the places of difference of opinion, يَصِحُّ الْإِقْتِدَاءُ بِهِ فِي الْأَصَحِّ. It is valid to pray behind them. وَيُكْرَهْ كَمَا فِي الْمُجْتَبَى. But it's disliked according to the mujtaba. Anyone who feels emotional here should leave their emotions on the side. Okay. So, firstly, there are two opinions within the madhab, that if I want to pray behind somebody, according to whose madhab does their prayer have to be valid? The legally sounder opinion is, according to the madhab of the follower. I want to pray behind someone, I should believe that their prayer is valid according to my understanding. That's a stronger legal opinion. The other opinion is, as long as it's valid according to their madhab. Right? This is less legally strong. A lot of ulama say this should be practiced in our times, given the widespread nature of ignorance. Because the basis is, what do we do with the khilaf? We avoid it. Right? So if you're Hanafi and you're leading people in a place where there's a lot of Shafi'is, what should you do? You should be precautious and pray in a manner that's valid both according to the Hanafi school and the Shafi'i school. Why? Because you're leading both Hanafis and Shafi'is, and the things that bring people together are praiseworthy. Right? And that's why historically in all the big cities where there are people of multiple madhabs, you'd find the average alim would be very well familiar with the other madhabs that are present. Because people come, and they ask a common question, they know the answer according to the other madhab as well. They would have typically studied several schools. Right? One of the teachers I studied with 23 years ago in Damascus, and he was an alim back then. Now, he's in his late 40s. On a weekly basis, he studies, and he's Hanafi, he studies upper intermediate level Shafi'i fiqh with Shaykh Muhammad Shuqair. And he's been attending that class for years. He's not Shafi'i, he doesn't plan to act on the Shafi'i school, but to know it well, because people have their questions, to know when to give a dispensation or a cautious position, but based on knowledge. That's the context. That's how people of knowledge are supposed to be. Okay. So the stronger opinion is, Imam Tahtawi mentions in the footnote, that al-ibra al-asah and al-ibra bi ra'yi al-ma'mum. The stronger opinion is that the validity of the Imam's prayer is judged according to the madhab of the follower with respect to the follower. The other opinion is, if it's valid according to the Imam's madhab, it's valid. Many give fatwa according to that in our times. And this is what was suggested by Shaykh Abdul Fattah Abu Ghudda, for example. He quotes Imam Muhammad, amongst others, Imam Anwar Shah al-Kashmiri from Faydul Bari, Sharh Sahih al-Bukhari, that this would be the more suitable opinion to take for our times, given the divided nature of the ummah and the widespread ignorance, even amongst those leading prayers. Right? But both opinions exist, and the works of taqleed discuss this issue as well. Okay. Then there's this issue of, what about as-salatu khalf al-mukhalif? In general, now before we get to that, there's one other issue, that the basis of someone else's actions is as-sihha. Someone's going to lead the prayer, you're lining up. How would you feel if I came up to you, if you're going to lead the prayer, and say, do you have wudu? How do you feel? In front of everybody. Like you're standing to lead the prayer. If I went up to you and I said, do you have wudu today? How would you feel? Be honest. Oh, you'd be offended, right? It's rude, right? The basis is that you assume that people, like someone is going to lead, that they have wudu, right? That is muqtada husn al-dhan. That's important. It's contrary to the sunnah to ask about these kinds of things. Especially, لا تسألوا عن أشياء إن تبدأ لكم تسؤكم. Don't ask about things if they become apparent would be displeasing to you. Imagine we all need to pray. Middle of the day, Dhuhr, we need to pray. I ask the Imam, do you have wudu? He says, oh, I don't. And then he goes to make wudu. Now, we all have to wait for the Imam. Right? So that's important. And there's many texts related to that we've seen before. But this also highlights, then there's also another thing, that fiqh tells you rulings in of themselves, right? There's two different things. What is the al-hukm fi haddi dhatihi, and then what is the al-hukm inda tatbiqihi? What is the ruling in of itself? And then what's the ruling when applied? Let's say some young man, do men require permission of their parents to marry? No. How would you feel if you heard some young man got married and just showed up to seeke and say, oh, this is my wife, by the way? How would anybody feel about that? Why? Because something may be in of itself permissible, but applying a ruling needs to consider the directly related considerations. So marrying without permission, for a man to marry without parents' permission, is completely permissible. But in the general case, doing so, actually, what would it entail? What's the most direct ruling that's related to it? Uququl walidain, hurting one's parents, bringing them sorrow, grief, so many things. Harming relations, qati'ah, even with relatives, right? So that's where, in a situation like this, we have to appreciate. the rulings mentioned here are in of themselves. How does one apply those? There are considerations, right? There are considerations. Like, what is your local masjid? Does this affect the community of the believers or not, etc. Right? So it's in of itself. But then also there are other considerations. If one knows that the person is not careful in the issues of difference, what are the mawadi' al-khilaf? This is just fi shurut wa arkan as-salah, right? Right? Min shurut wa arkan as-salah, from the conditions and integrals of the prayer. Ibn Abdin quotes the treatise here of Mullah Ali al-Qari on this issue, right, and others. Right? That if one knows that the person is not careful in the issues of difference of the things that affect the validity and invalidity of the prayer. Because the basis is each person is going to follow the sunnahs and mustahabbat of their madhab, but those don't affect the validity of the prayer. Even the wajib, they may consider, because mujtahad fihi, it's a matter of ijtihad, they consider it a sunnah, or they don't consider that wajib. So it's only in the shurut and arkan of the prayer. Right? Shurut and arkan of the prayer and of wudu. Right? Can you conceive of someone not, what are the arkan of the prayer? There's no madhab that says you can pray naked, facing away from the qibla, with a lot of filth on you. Right? Right? So this is highly unlikely. This would be someone who doesn't care, right? Or who deliberately acts in a way to provoke others. Then that's the scenario. But if someone is careful in the areas of difference, meaning that they don't do anything outwardly that would be invalidating the prayer according to our madhab, then it's valid to pray behind them. Then is it makruh? Right? Is it makruh? Right? And actually this issue of the shurut and arkan is also mentioned by Imam al-Tahtawi. Right? What is this Risala Tuhfat al-Akhyar that Tahtawi mentions? If you just look for that. Right? The same thing that's mentioned in Ibn Abdin, mentioned by Tahtawi, that being careful, right, in the difference of opinion has to do with the conditions and integrals, also mentioned by Imam al-Tahtawi. Anyways, so you assume validity. There are troublesome situations, right, where al-ibra bi ra'yi al-imam, if it's valid according to the other madhab. There's also the issue of when you have choice and when you don't. عند الاختيار وعند الاضطرار. عند الاختيار, so there's an imam who's unlearned, who does things that often are questionable in terms of validity in my madhab. I'm going down the street, I can go to questionable masjid, I can go to a masjid where the imam practices on the basis of knowledge. Where should I go? One where it acts on the basis of knowledge. They don't do things that make the prayer questionable. Now, is there then in itself, now this is important, in itself, في حد ذاته, in of itself, is there karaha في الصلاة خلف المخالف? Right? Is there dislike in praying behind someone of another madhab? Now there's two things, in of itself and the practice. In of itself, some of the fuqaha said yes. Because I believe certain things to be emphasized sunnahs, blameworthy to leave. The imam's not doing them. That's in of itself. right? But in practice, then applying it, if I were not to pray behind him, what would I be doing? Praying alone? Causing division amongst the Muslims? Imagine, go to the masjid, they're praying in jama'ah, what do? I go sit on a chair, wait for them to finish. Miss the jama'ah, divide the Muslims, etc. So given these considerations, some would say it's in of itself superior to choose someone of your own madhab, in of itself. But if this would lead to division, dispute, etc., or missing of the jama'ah, etc., there's no karaha. فَلَا karaha. And you can see there's extensive discussion on this issue in the treatises that we mentioned last time, Hamawi, Shurun Bulali, Sidi Abdul Ghani Nabulsi, and also in Hashit ibn Abdin, where there's also a treatise referred to by Mullah Ali al-Qari on this point. And this is discussed in Fayd al-Bari of Alam al-Kashmiri. It's quoted from Fayd al-Bari by Shaykh Abdul Fattah Abu Ghudda in Tarajimu ستة من فقهاء العالم الإسلامي من القرن الرابع عشر, which has biographies of 6 great fuqaha of the 14th century. One of those 6 is Imam Anwar Shah al-Kashmiri. And Shaykh Abdul Fattah quotes this bistihsan. I was very happy because there was an issue in Amman and Shaykh Nuh Keller sought a fatwa on praying at the local masjid because the Imam did a number of things that, according to the sounder position in the Shafi'i madhab, would be problematic, would invalidate the prayer. And there's a whole list of such questions. Also praying behind people who wipe over socks and so on, socks that don't fulfill the more correct opinion in the Shafi'i school, etc. So Shaykh, there are a series of issues that Habib Zayn ibn Sumayt gave fatwa on. And one of them was praying behind someone who's following another opinion that's valid according to one of the madhabs. And he quoted Imam al-Kashmiri amongst the other proofs that he gave. I was, as the Indian in the majlis, I was so happy, right? But anyways, right? But this shows you, right? Right? So if the person acts on the basis of knowledge, right? So they avoid the khilaf, but they also do the sunnahs broadly, then there wouldn't be karaha, even intrinsic according to some, right? But extrinsically, one doesn't do anything that there's tafriqul jama'ah, that would divide the congregation. That's why Imam, and that's why you have to, when books are quoted, okay, that's what the text says. How is it understood and how is it implemented, right? And that's why talaqqi is so important. So Imam Ibn Hajar al-Haytami, the Imam of the Shafi'i school, in most of his works on Shafi'i fiqh, he took a position that al-infiradu awla min as-salati khalf al-mukhalif. Praying on your own is better than praying behind someone of another madhab. And some of our attitudinally divergent brethren, may Allah bless us and them, go, ooh, look, they divided the ummah. Who's dividing the ummah? You guys. Right? The ummah was the ummah before. Right? You're the guys who kick all people out of the ummah. Anyways, that's what he said. But what does it mean? Right? Just because, how do we understand texts? Who are the custodians of meanings? The ulama. How do the ulama understand that text? So you see an insight, it's mentioned in multiple biographies of Ibn Hajar that some young scholars came to visit Ibn Hajar. And when they prayed, and Ibn Hajar was originally Egyptian, was from Egypt, but he had migrated to Mecca. That's also sometimes he's referred to as Ibn Hajar al-Makki. So they prayed behind the Shafi'i congregation at the Haram. They didn't find Ibn Hajar. So they asked Where would Ibn Hajar be? He said, oh, he always prays behind the Hanafi congregation. They'd read his books, that's why they'd gone to meet him. So they went looking for him and they asked after the prayer that, we've read in your books that it's better to pray on one's own than to pray behind someone of another madhab. He said, تلك الفتوى وهذا العمل. That's the ruling, this is the practice. And what he meant there is, that's the ruling in of itself. But when you apply it, there are many considerations that enter. And that's why there's a difference between fiqh and fatwa. Fatwa in the sense of إنزال حكم شرعي على واقعة معينة, is to apply a legal ruling to a specific context. Someone could have read all the books of fiqh and know everything that's said in the madhab. All you could say, you understand the legal rulings. Does not mean that you understand how to apply them to individual contexts. That's a separate. Fiqh is one thing, fatwa is another. Also, of course, that's the danger of studying with people who kind of learn on their own without recourse, without having studied fully with the mashayikh and without training with the mashayikh and without awareness of how to apply the rulings to specific situations. I have never met a Hanafi faqih in my life who has said that it's makruh to pray behind someone of another madhab, practically, ever. Alhamdulillah, I've met ulama from Sham, from Jordan, from Iraq, from Egypt, from Turkey, from India, from Pakistan, from Burma, from Bangladesh, from many countries, excellent Hanafi fuqaha. Never heard anybody state anything like that. Why? Is it there in the books? Yes, but what does it mean? Simple as that. Right? And there's a beautiful text, just since we're unpacking this issue, there's a beautiful text by Imam, mentioned by Maulana Zayn ibn Nujaym, Zaynuddin ibn Nujaym, the author of al-Bahr al-Ra'iq, who mentions that basically وَقَصْدُهُمْ مِنْ إِطْلَاقِ عِبَارَاتِهِمْ, the reason they sometimes mention some expressions unconditioned, right? أن لا يدعي علمهم من لم يزاحمهم عليه بالركب عند المشايخ, right? That the reason the ulama sometimes mention some things unconditioned, sort of just generally, is that this knowledge not be claimed by those who haven't vied with the ulama with their knees in taking the knowledge from the people of knowledge, right? So that the pretenders and the people of actual knowledge be clear, right? That right? And this is quoted by Ibn Abidin, right? Bistihsan. That's the rough meaning of the text. If you remind me, I'll share the actual text. وَقَصْدُهُمْ مِنْ إِطْلَاقِ عِبَارَاتِهِمْ. You should be able to find it in the Hashiyah easily. I check, you should be able to find it in the Bahr al-Ra'iq directly, but Ibn Abdin then adds some points to it. That's very important, right? In our times, we have a lot of people who are just textualists. They just learn from texts and لا ثقة بعلمهم. Ibn Abi Hatim al-Razi said, لا تأخذ القرآن عن مصحفي ولا العلم عن صحافي. right? That don't take the Quran from someone who just learnt it from the Mus'haf. And don't take knowledge from someone who just learnt it from books. Okay. وقال الديري في شرحه لا يكره إذا علم منه الاحتياط في مذهب الحنفي. There's no karaha if one knows that the person is cautious according to the Hanafi madhab, meaning that they're careful that their prayer is valid. أما إذا علم المقتدي من الإمام ما يفسد الصلاة على زعم الإمام. As for if you know that if the follower knows that the Imam's prayer is invalid according to the opinion of the Imam himself, كمس المرأة أو الذكر, such as touching a woman or touching their private parts, أو حمل نجاسة قدر درهم, or they have more than 1 dirham of filth on them. والإمام لا يدري بذلك, and the Imam is unaware of that, فإنه يجوز اقتداء به, then it's valid to follow them على قول الأكثر, according to most people. وقال بعضهم لا يجوز, and some said it's not valid. Okay? In our times, the caution is, there's someone leading, you pray behind them. Okay? Where you have a choice, choose someone, learn it. وجه الأول وهو الأصح أن المقتدي يرى جواز صلاة إمامه والمعتبر في حقه رأي نفسه. The reasoning of the first opinion is, and that's the more correct, is that the follower sees that the prayer of the Imam is valid according to their opinion, and what counts for the follower is his opinion as to the validity of the prayer. فوجب القول بجوازها كما في التبيين. So it would entail that even if the Imam did something that according to his madhab, in the Shafi'i school, skin-to-skin contact with the opposite sex, or touching one's private parts directly. Now, how would you know that someone touched their private parts and not their underwear or something? Like, that's too much probing. Like someone stuck their hand in their pants, God forbid. Firstly, what's such a person doing becoming an Imam? Okay? But even if they did, how do you know that they're wearing underwear or not? Or where did their hands go? If you're staring at people like that, lower your gaze. Right? Right? But theoretically speaking, right? Right? كما في التبيين وفتح القدير. وإنما قيد بقوله والإمام لا يدري, and said we limited this by saying and the Imam doesn't know بذلك فيكون جازما بالنية, because then they have a firm intention. وأمكن حمل صحة صلاته على معتقد إمامه. It'd be possible to deem that their prayer is valid according to the opinion of the Imam. أما إذا علم وهو على اعتقاد مذهبه صار كالمتلاعب. But if the Imam knows that they've done something that breaks their prayer, but still the Imam is going to lead, then this is like a mutalaib, someone who's mucking about, right? وَلَا النِّيَّ لَهُ. And how could you begin a prayer with intention if you pause and ask the person, is this prayer valid? They say no. Okay? But this is just a largely theoretical issue. فَلَا وَجْهَ لِحَمْلِ صِحَّةِ صَلَاتِهِ. So there's no way of deeming their prayer valid. Unless one were to say that, maybe they're taking another opinion, because you don't have to stick to one madhab, right? Maybe they're following another opinion. So the summary is, there are two opinions about the validity of following behind the Imam. The legally stronger opinion is, what counts as, in terms of can you pray behind someone? The stronger opinion legally is their prayer valid according to your madhab? The less strong legal opinion, but the fatwa position in our times, according to many, many ulama, is if the prayer is valid according to the opinion of the Imam, you could pray behind them. And the consideration of not doing things that divide the ummah, especially in our time of division, is very important. So one of the issues that arises, for example, that from this is in Ramadan. Can we pray behind witr? What is the witr prayer in the Hanafi school? How many rak'ahs? There's only one way the witr prayer is performed in the Hanafi madhab. 3 rak'ahs with only one set of salams. Full stop. That's it. In the Shafi'i school, witr is done 2 rak'ahs and then salam and then 1 rak'ah on its own. That's not valid in the Hanafi school. Could you pray behind someone who's praying like that? Theoretically, no, because your prayer behind them is not valid. But that's where fiqh is one thing, fatwa is another, even in your own practice. Right? And that's why you should consult scholars. A situation like that applies. Don't just give fatwa to yourself. Like, I'm shocked how rarely do students of knowledge ask questions about their own practice. Because either they're receiving divine inspiration, but even if you're receiving divine inspiration, you should be confirming it with somebody. Because divine inspiration is not proof. Right? That's why people who don't ask questions about their personal practice, the ulama, unless they have other teachers somewhere, they don't take them seriously, right? Because what's the state of their religious understanding? And I know people have consulted their teachers, they studied with them for years. Asked about them teaching with us, for purpose of consultation. So I don't know anything about him. I said, Sidi, but he read a lot of books with you. I said, Qara. He said he studied, yeah. But I don't know what's his understanding. Because 2 separate things. Right? That's why it's very important to ask, to consult. But here, personally, I'm not comfortable with that at my own, but what a number of the major ulama affirm is that one, this is the fatwa, for example, Mufti Rafi Usmani, this is what, for example, Darul Ulum Karachi gives fatwa on, specifically. They take this position to say that if at the haram, for example, pray behind, the common person should pray behind the imam when they're praying witr as 2 plus 1. And that's what they say, and that's what they teach, and they use this as a reasoning, also because of the issue of tafarruq al-Muslimin. I won't say I'm entirely convinced by that, but there are some of the Hanafis who took this opinion amongst the late ulama due to this issue of tafarruq and so on. Amongst them, the great Allama Bahr al-Ulum al-Laknawi, which is other than Maulana Abdul Hayy, in his Rasail al-Arkan. I don't know if Rasail al-Arkan has been published in a modern edition. The old I have a copy of the old copy, and I think it's now online too. Rasail al-Arkan. It's a good book. He has some, because he's a very capable alim, so he has some unique opinions. But anyways, so I tried to press Mufti Rafi, would it be better to repeat that witr? He said, what we tell people is, your prayer is valid. So I pressed him. He said, what we tell people is your prayer is valid. I said, so what's more cautious? He said, what we tell people is. I said, but if someone asked you what's better to do, he said, what we tell people is your prayer is valid. He smiled. He's just shaking his head. So I asked Sayyidi, so he said, الاحتياط لا يخفى على أهل الاحتياط. Right? Caution is clear for the people who understand the principles of caution. If someone doesn't know how to be cautious, then their problem is that they don't have knowledge yet. You're not of Ahl al-Ihtiyat. You're not from the people of caution. Okay. Allah. Okay. So that's the issue. One of the Sindhis also has a risala fil salah khalf al mukhalif. Others, it's a lengthy issue of back and forth. Some are more expansive, some are more rigid. One of the great characteristics of Sayyidi Muhammad Amin ibn Abdin is his balance. Of the many mahasin of Ibn Abdin, is his balance. Right? Has a very level temperament when addressing issues. Rahmatullahi ta'ala alayhi. Okay. وصح اقتداء متوضئ بمتيمم. It is valid for someone with wudu as a follower to pray behind someone who's praying with tayammum. Right? عندهما, according to the Imam and Abu Yusuf. وقال محمد لا يصح. Now Muhammad said it's not valid. والخلاف مبني على أن الخلفية بين الآلتين التراب والماء أو الطهارتين الوضوء والتيمم. Right? And this difference arises from what is the substitute. Right? With respect to wudu and tayammum. Is the substitute in the tool, in the instrument, which is dust, or soil and water, or between at-taharatain, or two states of purity, namely wudu itself and tayammum. فعندهما, so according to Imam Abu Hanifa and Abu Yusuf, بين الآلتين, between two instruments, both are means of tahara. Right? So you're both in the same state. So Imam Abu Hanifa and Imam Abu Yusuf considered that that from wudu and tayammum, the khalaf, the substitute is إِن لَمْ تَجِدُوا مَاءً فَتَيَمَّمُوا. If you don't find water, then, and what does tayammamu mean? Then seek topsoil and perform the acts of tayammum. Right? فَتَيَمَّمُوا there, what does... So it's a trick question. If you ask a Hanafi, what does, in the verse, إِن لَمْ تَجِدُوا مَاءً فَتَيَمَّمُوا, what does tayammamu mean? If you do not find water, then seek topsoil and do this and this with. Right? It's not, and perform tayammum. Right? وظاهر النص يدل عليه, and the outward purport of the text that we just quoted, right, points to that. فلم تجدوا ماء فتيمموا صعيدا طيبا. Right? Right? Tayammamu, then seek. Tayammamu here, then seek sa'idan, topsoil that is pure. فاستوت طهارتين. So in this level, by this consideration, both taharas, wudu is a means, wudu and tayammum are both lead to an equivalent state of tahara. فاستوت طهارتان. وعند محمد بين الطهارتين. But the substitute, according to Imam Muhammad, is between two states of purity, التيمم والوضوء فيصير بناء فيصير هذا بناء القوي على الضعيف. So it would become building the stronger, which is wudu, on the weaker, which is tayammum. وهو لا يجوز, and this is not valid. ولا خلاف في صحة الاقتداء بالمتيمم في صلاة الجنازة. But everyone agreed in our madhab, the three main imams, that you can pray, that the one with wudu can pray behind the one with tayammum with respect to Salat al-Janazah. The reasoning of which can be found in the suitable place. وصح اقتداء غاسل بماسح, and it is valid for someone who washed their feet to pray behind someone who wiped their khuf. ماسح على خف. أو جبيرة, or with a jabira, with a cast. Because what's the principle with respect to bandages and casts? Yeah. المسح كالغسل, المسح على الجبيرة كالغسل لما تحتها. Wiping over a cast or a bandage is like washing what is underneath. أو خرقة قرحة لا يسيل منها شيء, or upon a bandage over a wound from which nothing flows. Right? If they wiped over that bandage, same thing. وصح اقتداء قائم بقاعد. Okay, now you can pray in three ways. Standing, which is when you stand and prostrate, and prostration is putting your forehead on the ground. Standing, or they're sitting. What is qa'id? What does qa'id mean? What does qa'id mean? Qa'id means sitting on the ground with prostration. So the qa'id is the one who prays practically without standing, but they still prostrate. The third level, so you say sitting on the ground, right? So they, with prostration. The third level is ima, which is praying with head movements. Which is what, so that's why how you translate it, qa'id is not just sitting, right? It's sitting on the ground with prostration. Now the qiyas would be the primary line of legal reasoning would be that praying standing is a full state. Praying sitting on the ground would be a weak state. Why? Because you omitted one of the integrals of the fard prayer, which is al-qiyam. Now the fuqaha theorized a lot of it. Sometimes you wonder, why are they saying this? That there's rukn asli and rukn zaid. There's a fundamental integral and there's an extra integral. And the extra integral, a rukn zaid ma huwa qabilun lis-suqut, is that which can be omitted in certain circumstances. I say, this is falsafa. No, it's not falsafa. It has practical implications legally. Anyways, the primary line of legal reasoning would be that someone praying standing can't pray behind someone sitting on the ground. But this primary line of legal reasoning, this is called the qiyas, right, which is an-nazar al-fiqhi al-awwal, the first line of legal reasoning. But this, the validity of a standing person praying behind someone who's praying sitting down, meaning sitting on the ground with prostration, this is called istihsan. This is istihsan bin nas. We leave the primary line of legal reasoning due to the existence of a specific text, which is what Imam Shurumbulali will mention. Right? So هذا it's called istihsan bin nas, a legal preference. We left that in of itself, if we didn't look at any specific evidences related to this, the mujtahid's line of reasoning would have entailed that this should not be valid. But they left that primary line of legal reasoning due to the presence of permitting texts. وصح اقتداء قائم بقاعد. It's valid for someone who is standing to pray behind someone who's praying sitting down. Imam al-Tahtawi clarifies, أي يركع ويسجد. But they mention that the position of Imam Muhammad is in itself more precautious, right? To avoid the khilaf of other madhabs and so on. But there's a lot of back and forth, because others said, no, not necessarily. Why? لثبوته عن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم. Right? But then that's where there's a difference between the Imam of the masjid is a learned scholar and they wounded their knee, so they're praying sitting on the ground, so you pray behind them, and they're choosing somebody, and it's either me or you, and I can't pray standing, so you lead, it'll be better because you're praying standing, right? And what's the basis that the standing person can pray behind someone who's sitting down on the ground with prostration? لأن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم صلى الظهر يوم السبت أو الأحد في مرض موته جالسا والناس خلفه قياما. Because the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم prayed dhuhr on the Saturday or the Sunday in his final sickness, sitting on the ground, while the people behind him were praying standing. وهي آخر صلاة صلاها إماما, and this is the last prayer that he performed as the Imam. وصلى خلف أبي بكر الركعة الثانية صبح يوم الاثنين, and he صلى الله عليه وسلم prayed behind Sayyidina Abu Bakr رضي الله تعالى عنه the second rak'ah of Fajr on the Monday, مأموما, as a follower. ثم أتم لنفسه, and then he completed the prayer on his own. And this is an extra fa'idah that he mentioned, right? And they discuss هل اقتدى النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم بغيره في الصلاة. And we know from his final prayer in congregation, he prayed behind Sayyidina Abu Bakr. But there are a number of other reported incidents, some soundly established, some that are mahal bahth, as to other prayers that the Prophet ﷺ performed behind someone else. And these are discussed. If you look in Mawahib al-Ladunniya and its sharh by Zurqani, this comes up, also mentioned in Subul al-Huda wal-Rashad, the sharh of Sirat ibn Hisham, and it's discussed by, it mentioned in Hashit ibn Abdin, etc., but quoting the appropriate sources. So point being that the Prophet ﷺ prayed behind, prayed sitting down. That's the mawdi' shahid here. Now this is where also we have to instill in people the sense, especially Arabs feel very confident. خلاص مذكور في الحديث. Yeah, but what does it mean? And what we have to reiterate, look, we have the hadith, look in the sharh of the hadith. Right? If there's a Quranic ayah, look in the tafsir. How did the Imams of the deen understand it? Lest we misinterpret. So qu'ud does not mean sitting on a chair. It means sitting on the ground with prostration. And that's what the Prophet ﷺ did. Right? صلي إماما فإن لم تستطع فإماء فقاعدا. صلي إماما فإن لم تستطع صلي قائما. صلي قائما فإن لم تستطع فقاعدا فإن لم تستطع فأومئ إيماء. Right? قاعدا, what's the difference between qu'ud and إيماء? Qu'ud is with prostration, is on the ground with prostration. There's also in Arabic, there's difference between qa'ada and jalasa. Right? Especially in classical Arabic. So one needs to be careful, right? وصح اقتداء صح اقتداء بأحدب لم يبلغ حدبه حد الركوع اتفاقا على الأصح. It is valid to pray behind someone who has a hunched back. Right? Right? If their hunch does not reach the level of ruku', then this is agreed upon. It's valid for someone who can stand straight to pray behind someone whose back is bent. If this does not reach the level of ruku', this agreed upon that it's valid. اتفاقا على الأصح, by agreement, agreement of our main Imams, Abu Hanifa and his two companions. على الأصح, that this is the more correct understanding of the later scholars of the difference of opinion, indicating that some people relate a difference of opinion between Abu Hanifa and his students on this, but this is the most correct position. Right? And Imam Tahtawi explains what is meant by this expression, اتفاقا على الأصح, by agreement, meaning of our three Imams, على الأصح, in في أصح حكاية للخلاف في المسألة, in the soundest narration of there being or not being difference on the issue. Okay. وإذا بلغ وهو ينخفض للركوع قليلا يجوز عندهما, وبه أخذ عامة العلماء وهو الأصح بمنزلة الاقتداء بالقاعد لاستواء نصفه الأسفل, ولا يجوز عند محمد. Right? And if a person's back is bent such that it's already in the state of ruku', such that if they extended their hands would reach their knee, then if they're able to move their back a little extra, then praying behind someone with a hunched back like that would be valid according to Abu Hanifa and Abu Yusuf. And this was the position taken by the generality of the scholars. Ammatul ulama does not mean, because al-amma can mean the common person. Right? But ammatul ulama doesn't mean the common scholars. That there's ammatul ulama and khassatul ulama, the common scholars and the general scholars. Ammatul ulama means the generality of the scholars. And which scholars? Right? Right? The scholars whose opinion counts in ikhtiyar and tarjih, in choosing legal opinions. So meaning أكثر علماء الترجيح. Right? Right? Most of the scholars of وهو الأصح. Right? And this is the most sound opinion. بمنزلة الاقتداء بالقاعد. And this is like following behind someone who is sitting on the ground. لاستواء نصفه الأسفل. Right? Because their bottom half is straight. Well, because the one who prays sitting on the ground, the qa'id, what is their ruku'? Like if you're praying sitting on the ground, what is your ruku'? You're just bending the head a little bit. You don't have to, because if you're sitting on the ground, your hands are already reaching your knees. Right? ولا يجوز عند محمد. But according to Imam Muhammad, this is not valid. قال الزيلعي, قال الإمام الزيلعي صاحب التبيين, the author of تبيين الحقائق, وفي الظهيرية هو الأصح. And in the ظهيرية, this is the more correct opinion. انتهى. فقد اختلف التصحيح فيه. So the تصحيح varies, and that's what is indicated by his saying في الأصح. There are some opinions that chose this. That's one interpretation. Imam al-Tahtawi says that هو الأصح, he understands it to be في الأصح من قولي الإمام محمد. This is the stronger of two narrations from Imam Muhammad. Allahu A'lam. It would require looking in the Fatawa al-Zahiriyya that what is actually right, mentioned, right? And this is what was chosen by Sayyid Abu Saud as well. وفي الظاهرية, right? هو الأصح, right? So this would be أصح من القولين عن محمد, right? Did any editor mention anything here of significant?
I have the same thing, just that at the end, he says the end of Muhammad.
بسم الله. Good. وصح اقتداء مومن بمثله. It is valid for one person praying with head movements to pray behind another person with head movements. بأن كانا قاعدين أو مضطجعين. Whether the people praying with head movements are both sitting and praying with head movements, i.e. without prostration, أو المأموم مضطجعا والإمام قاعدا لقوة حاله. Or if the follower is praying lying down, مضطجع, اضطجع, lying on their side, and the Imam seated with head movements. Because the Imam's state is stronger. Because being seated is a higher state, because at least you have some of the form of the prayer rather than the person praying with head movements, lying on their side. ومتنفل بمفترض. وصح اقتداء متنفل بمفترض. It is valid for someone praying nafil to pray behind someone praying fard. And there's discussion, is this true of Taraweeh as well? Right? There's khilaf on it. Right? So according to al-Fatawa al-Khaniya, Fatawa Qadi Khan, and also according to al-Itqani in Ghayatul Bayan wa Nadiratul Zaman, it's a very interesting. Al-Itqani was a very interesting Hanafi. You can read his biography. Right? He said, some people describe the likes of him that لم يرى مثله ولم يرى مثل نفسه. That nobody like him was seen in his age, and he didn't see anyone like himself in his age. Now, some of the ulama, and this is unfair, and that's why the critiques in the books of history and stuff have to be taken with a grain of salt. They said that كان معجبا بنفسه and this, that. No, that's سوء الظن, right? You have to treat that because he was brilliant, no doubt. If you want to really appreciate his brilliance, if you look at his works in أصول الفقه, his الشامل في أصول الفقه, and his تبيين شرح أصول في شرح المنتخب of حسام الدين الإخسيخثي, famous as in the subcontinent they call it Husami. He is brilliant, one of the greatest usulis in the Hanafi madhab. Both the Shamil and the Tabiin are amazing. His sharh on the Hidayah, Ghayatul Bayan, is brilliant. But he's very opinionated, so he frequently has opinions that are unique to him. Right? Take any critique that's mentioned in the books of history with a grain of salt. unless there's clear proof. If you take everything the books of history mention, you're going to say absurdities. That one of the greatest theologians of Islam used to drink wine. Like someone said that about a common person, would you believe it? Someone told you that Brother Bilal drinks alcohol, would you believe it? What? No, it's obligatory to disbelieve it. Right? So obligatory to disbelieve it, and the principles of tale-bearing apply to it, which are six. There are 6 duties to someone who hears something bad about another. One of them, it's obligatory to disbelieve it. Imam Ghazali says obligatory to hate the person who mentions such a thing without a shari'i reason for the sake of Allah. And there's 6 duties, we should be familiar with them. And you don't investigate it. Because you have the asl al-thabit is you have husn al-dhann of a Muslim. Investigating that, unless you have a reason, unless you can, someone is asking you, you need, you know, because they want to redress a wrong, and you can redress a wrong. If you can't redress a wrong, then what do? You assist them in getting their wrong redressed. If you can't redress the wrong yourself, or assist them in redressing their wrong, then you make dua for them. Right? That's why don't allow, there's all kinds of poison floating around online about people and so on. And, you know, and for example, if someone makes their point against somebody, even if they're doing tadallam, just continue talking about it. وَلَا يعني what? بِالْأَلْقَابِ وَلَا تَنَابَزُوا بِالْأَلْقَابِ. Don't throw bad titles against others. So really be careful. You know, a lot of times of fitna makes otherwise sensible people behave like fools. وأعرض عن الجاهلين. الجاهل is من كان تصرفه خلاف تصرف العقلاء. Someone, it's not just, jahil is not just someone who doesn't have knowledge. Someone can be otherwise learned, otherwise intelligent, but if on some matter they're not acting in accordance with knowledge and aql, that this action does not correspond with the principles of religion, reason, and good customary practice, keep away from them. أعرض عن الجاهلين. Anyways, so there's ikhtilaf. So in Taraweeh, some of the ulama made exception of Taraweeh, that you can't pray Taraweeh behind someone praying the fard. Others said no, you can. This is general, right? And that appears to be what Imam al-Shurunbulali makes it general. متنفل بمفترض. Anyone praying nafil behind anyone praying fard. And from the nafil is Taraweeh. There are 2 opinions about Taraweeh. And why is it practical? You come to the masjid, you prayed your Isha in one masjid. You go to another masjid and they finished. So you saw someone praying, you thought they're doing Taraweeh because it's so late. So you prayed behind them, but they were actually praying Isha because the muezzin gave the adhan and then fell asleep and they couldn't wake him up. So when they're leaving, they knocked, they knocked on the muezzin's door and he woke up, said, we're all leaving. So he decided to pray Isha. You went late to the masjid hoping to catch some rakats of Taraweeh. You saw someone praying, you prayed behind them. So you prayed Taraweeh. He said, I was praying Isha. Is it valid? There are 2 opinions. What Imam Shurunbulali indicates is that it's valid. متنفل بمفترض. There's an opinion that there's an opinion um, it's valid, the position of Qadi Khan and others, that because Taraweeh has a hay'a makhsusa, etc. So it's a position of caution, but there is. So does it count as Taraweeh? There's an opinion that yes, and that's what Shurun Bulali's opinion seems to indicate. But the other one, that it counts as Nafil, but it doesn't count as Taraweeh. That may be that is more precautious. Okay. Then there's one more important issue. Right? Let's read the matan first. وَإِنْ ظَهَرَ بُطْلَانُ صَلَاةِ إِمَامِهِ أَعَادَ. If one realizes that the Imam's prayer was invalid, one repeats the prayer. Now, if you have suspicions about the Imam, what do? You don't investigate. Right? Like I've been asked, like traveling, I had my socks on. They don't even know how I made wudu. Someone asked me, like I'm sitting cross-legged, they say, Shaykh, do you mind if I touch your socks? I said, sure, go ahead. He like felt my socks. I said, Shaykh, I kid you not, did you wipe over those? And I hadn't. Although when I'm traveling, I usually wear thick socks that are valid for sure to wipe on in the Hanafi school. It can be difficult when you're traveling. So why? Because we just prayed behind you. So I want to make sure the prayer is valid. In front of everybody. And of course I said, you have to have akhlaq with people. Say yes, alhamdulillah, I had washed my feet. I said good. But that's not, and of course we should be gentle with people, etc. Because just because they don't act correctly doesn't mean you don't act correctly. But that's not correct for any person. So you don't investigate. And the Prophet ﷺ said, وَلَنْ يُشَادَّ الدِّينَ أَحَدٌ إِلَّا غَلَبَ. No one makes religion difficult for themselves except that it will overwhelm them. الأصل حمل أفعال المكلفين على وجه الصحة والسداد. The basis is that we interpret the actions of those morally responsible in a manner that is sound, valid and sound, حيث أمكن, insofar as possible. من غير تكلف, without making far-fetched interpretations. So I asked different mashayikh, so what if you saw the Imam wipe over their socks? I said, assume they're valid to wipe on. And don't check. Because they have a good opinion of the person. I said, what if they're obviously thin? That means you look too long. I said, but if they're obviously thin, assume he already had wudu. That he's just renewing the wudu. Right? وإن ظهر بطلان صلاة إمامه بفوت شرط أو ركن أعاد لزوما، يعني افترض عليه الإتيان بالفرض وليس المراد الإعادة الجابرة لنقص صنف المؤدى. Right? If it becomes clear that the Imam's prayer was invalid due to the Imam not having fulfilled a condition or an integral, one prays again. Now the word i'ada is a technical term. That i'ada is a technical term. So here he's using a'ada yu'idu i'adatan in the linguistic meaning, which is to do it again. Because the term i'ada or repeat, right? So, right? Repeat, repeating a prayer has a technical usage. Right? You have Ada, qada, and i'ada. Ada is a current performance. A qada is you make up a prayer, right? Which is to fulfill the command after its time, right? I'ada is الاتيان بمثل الفرض لنقص فيه جابرا له, right? I'ada is to do the like of what you just did. You repeat the prayer, right? You do the fard again to make up for something that was deficient in it. For example, you prayed dhuhr, but on your own. There's a jama'ah. You can repeat the dhuhr. This is i'ada. What are you trying to make up for? The fact that the deficiency that you missed out on the reward of the fard. Or, for example, if you did the prayer with something makruh tahriman, something prohibited to the side, have you prayed? Yes. But if you pray again, have you done your fard? Yes. But with a nuqsan. So when you do it again to cover the deficiency, this is i'ada. But if your imam's prayer was invalid, are you doing i'ada in the technical sense? No, because your prayer wasn't valid. Because the follower's prayer is built on the imam's prayer, right? إذا بطل المتضمن بطل المتضمن. If if the foundation is broken, the building is not standing. So that's why he says this is required, meaning it's obligatory to perform the fard again, to perform the fard. And what's not meant is the repetition, meaning al-i'ada bil-ma'na al-istilahi. In the formal sense of the word i'ada, that compensates for a deficiency in what was done, in the way that we explained, right? Because that would entail that the prayer was valid but deficient. But here, it's as if you didn't pray. What's the basis for this? لِقَوْلِهِ صلى الله عليه وسلم, because of what's related from the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم. My copy, and I'm not pointing this out to criticize the editor, he's a noble man, but to point out that do not make takhrij in this way. ذكره ابن الجوزي في كتاب التحقيق في أحاديث الخلاف. Ibn al-Jawzi mentioned in his work on the hadiths that are the basis of difference of opinion. This is not a source for hadith. What did Ibn al-Jawzi say about the hadiths? Also, the ulama who talked about hadith, in the science of hadith, they separate them between al-mutashaddidin and the mutasahilin and the mu'tadilin. Those who are very strict and those who are lax, either in tasheeh or in tad'if. Either in verifying hadith, they're very strict, they won't deem anything, they have very high standards for deeming a hadith sahih. And there's others who are very hard in deeming things weak. They quickly deem things weak. Ibn al-Jawzi did some great khidmah in the science of hadith, but he compiled the first really comprehensive work on the mawdu'at, on the hadiths that are fabricated. But in striving to gather the mawdu' hadiths, because it's the first comprehensive work like this, just for the hadith al-mawdu'ah, he included hadiths that are in Bukhari and Muslim by mistake. And of course, now we have books that have annotated his work, etc. So just Ibn al-Jawzi's word on its own is not of much consequence. My work, the second reference that's mentioned it, wal-Muttaqi al-Hindi. Al-Muttaqi al-Hindi was a good scholar. And known as al-Muttaqi because he was a God-fearing scholar. He wrote a book called Kanzul Ummal, a treasure chest for those who seek to act, where he tried to compile the largest possible compilation of the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ. He took al-Jami' al-Kabir of Imam al-Suyuti and added to it from other sources. But practically any hadith that is related anywhere will be in Kanz al-Ummal, but doesn't tell you anything about the hadith. So this is not one of the primary sources of hadith. Actually doesn't even tell you anything about the hadith. So it's a largely useless reference. Anyone have a better referencing than that?
I have the same shaykh but added to it Muhammad fil al-Falah.
Oh, that's a useful addition. Like all of this, like if you see things like this, it should make you say like, what's going on? Why? Because people are just quoting from one another. And nobody's actually going back and checking themselves, right? And that's just, there's a urf fasid, right? You don't judge people. If it's a urf, you have to be easygoing on people because, it's like, like if you go to Damascus, any house you go to pretty much will insist that you eat. My first Ramadan in Damascus, the first 4 days, 3 of them I wasn't able to go for Taraweeh. Because the neighbor, they feed you so much. I didn't master the art of protecting your plate. Because if you say, no, it's okay, what they'll do, they'll get someone from here to talk to you. So you look this way, so they'll slip food this way. So now you're guarding from here. So they'll get someone on this side to talk to you. So they'll slip food. Like, now, in itself, what is the sunnah? Is that you encourage someone to eat, but you don't over-insist. But if that's the urf, you have to be easygoing. But in itself, is that a good urf? No. It's not but you have to be easygoing on those things, right? Similarly, na'dhurhum, but it's not a good state, right? Imam Muhammad mentioned it in Kitab al-Athar, right? That's slightly more useful, right? Imam Muhammad al-Hasan in Kitab al-Athar, much of which is related from Imam Abu Hanifa. For some strange reason, it's published in English as Kitab al-Athar of Abu Hanifa. That's the title of the book, right? In English. And that's a problem. It's not the Kitab al-Athar of Abu Hanifa. A lot of it is not related from Abu Hanifa. It was compiled by Muhammad al-Hasan. A good chunk of the narrations go through Abu Hanifa, a good chunk don't. Anyways. إذا فسدت صلاة الإمام فسدت صلاة من خلفه. If the prayer of the Imam is invalid, the prayer of those behind him is also invalid. وإذا طرأ المبطل لا إعادة على المأموم. Then إذا طرأ المبطل, if something invalidating happens, طرأ أي بعد الصلاة, after the prayer, something invalidating happens, لا إعادة على المأموم, then there's no need for the follower to repeat. كارتداد الإمام, such as the Imam committing apostasy. وَالْعِيَاذُ بِاللَّهِ. Meaning, the Imam prayed, and then someone corrected him. And he says, I'm fed up. He says something of kufr, and he goes to the church. If it happens after the fact, the prayer before would be considered valid. نسأل الله العافية. وسعيه للجمعة, or بعد ظهره دونهم, right? And we'll see this when we get to Jumu'ah. If some people prayed Dhuhr together in congregation, and then the Imam decides to go and attend Jumu'ah, then by going to attend Jumu'ah, his prayer becomes invalid. But when does it become invalid? After the Dhuhr was valid. So that would affect the Imam's Dhuhr, but not the Dhuhr of those. So scenario, 4 people are sick in hospital in the city. So he said, okay, time is in, let's pray together. Because they're all in the ward together. The nurse had taken them all to make wudu together. So we all have wudu, let's pray. So they prayed. Then one of them, by leading them in prayer, he feels energetic. So he says, I'm going to go to Salatul Jumu'ah. That Dhuhr no longer counts for the Imam. But he completed the Dhuhr validly. So if the invalidator happens after, it doesn't affect the valid prayer with respect to them. وَعُودُهِ لِسُجُودِ التِّلَاوَةِ بَعْدَ تَفَرُّقِهِمْ. Or if someone returns to make sujood al-tilawa of the prayer after the jama'ah has departed. Right? Someone, dhuhr prayer, quietly, he finished the prayer and he's sitting making tasbih. So 3 people behind him left the masjid. He's one making dhikr, he says, you know what? In first rak'ah I recited Surah Iqra. I didn't perform for prostration. You could still, as we will see when we come to sujood al-tilawa, have we covered sujood al-tilawa? No. You could, as long as you didn't do anything that invalidates the prayer, you could re-enter the prayer and perform sujood al-tilawa. He hasn't left the place, he hasn't moved on to some, to other actions. He's only making dhikr. You can return. So that, but their prayer was done because he gave salams. So if they left, then the prayer would be valid. There's some details, you can see them in Tahtawi. Now what about, does the Imam have to tell the people that my prayer was invalid? And you prayed without wudu. Now if you have waswasa, what do? You don't try to be cautious, yourself even. Right? So this is assuming that the person themselves don't have waswasa, because even for your own self, don't repeat the prayer. Your assumption is, if you've done it, it's valid, ignore your doubt. But in general, if you realize your prayer is not valid, you inform people. That's general. We'll look at some exceptions though. Right? ويلزم الإمام يعني الذي تبين فساد صلاته إعلام القوم بإعادة صلاتهم. يلزم الإمام, the fa'il is إعلام. Right? It is required for the Imam, for whom it becomes clear without doubt that his prayer was invalid, to inform al-qawm, the people who prayed behind him, to repeat their prayer. بالقدر الممكن, to the extent possible. ولو بكتاب أو رسول, even if it be in writing or by sending a messenger to tell people, and you send someone to the marketplace, anyone who prayed behind the Imam today, repeat their prayer. Okay? في المختار, according to the chosen position. لأنه صلى الله عليه وسلم صلى بهم ثم جاء ورأسه يقطر فأعاد بهم. Right? Because the Prophet ﷺ led the companions in prayer, then he came back with his head dripping with water, meaning having done wudu, and he repeated the prayer with them. وسيدنا علي رضي الله تعالى عنه صلى بالناس ثم تبين له أنه كان محدثا فأعاد وأمرهم أن يعيدوا. And likewise, Sayyidina Ali bin Abi Talib رضي الله عنه led people in prayer, then it became clear to him that he didn't have wudu, so he commanded the people to repeat their prayer. Right? So this is the relied upon position. Because the legal reason, the prayer of the followers is built upon the prayer of the Imam. If the Imam's prayer is invalid, their prayer is invalid. That's the qiyas as well. وَفِي الدِّرَايَةِ. Now the diraya refers to, in some places can refer to legal reasoning. There's riwaya and diraya. Riwaya, what does riwaya mean? Riwaya can mean, in a general sense, riwaya is what ma ruya an al-Nabi sallallahu alayhi wasallam, right? But riwaya, so you say, what's ilm al-riwaya? Is ilm al-hadith. And there's actually a book, You have famous books in hadith, like al-Kifaya fi ilm al-riwaya. So riwaya has a general sense in the Arabic language. Riwaya is that which is related. That's why one of the, what are stories called in Arabic? Riwaya. قرأت رواية لطيفة. I read a nice story. Right? Is that which is related? Could even be a story, right? That's a very general meaning in the Arabic language. But then there are different usages, right? Riwaya can refer to, according to أي ما يروى بالسند إما عن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم أو من بعده, right? The riwaya meaning في الحديث. But in the Hanafi madhab, there's a specific usage. الرواية is ما يروى عن أئمتنا الثلاثة, that which is related from our three main Imams, Abu Hanifa and his two companions, primarily Muhammad al-Hasan, Abu Yusuf and Muhammad al-Hasan. And diraya is the legal meaning, is the legal understanding. So in عقود رسم المفتي of Ibn Abdin says أنه لا يعدل عن دراية إن وافقتها رواية. One does not leave what is entailed by legal reasoning if it corresponds to a riwaya, meaning a narration from one of the Imams of our madhab, right? And that has its considerations, but here he's talking about a book, الدراية في شرح الهداية, right? One of the commentaries on the Hidayah. وفي الدراية لا يلزم الإمام الإعلام إذا كانوا قوما غير معينين. It's mentioned in the diraya that it's not required for the Imam to inform people if they are a non-specified group. وفي خزانة الأكمل, a book of فتاوى, لأنه سكت عن خطأ لأنه سكت عن خطأ معفو عنه, right? Because it's being silent about an excused mistake. وعن الوبري يخبرهم إذا كان مختلفا فيه. Right? وعن الوبري, and الوبري says ويخبرهم وإن كان مختلفا فيه. Al-Wabari said that he informs them even if it's differed upon, because some of them may want to exercise caution. ونظيره إذا رأى غيره يتوضأ من ماء نجس. And the example of that, if you see someone making wudu with najis water, أو على ثوبه نجاسة, or they have filth on their clothing, right? Why? If the water has najasa, but it's more than 2 qullas, you tell them according to your opinion. There's some khilaf on this issue, right? Some of the ulama have said that if it's a large congregation, يعني في الجمعة والجمع الكبير, then you don't have to tell them, because it'll cause fitna. One, because you can't really do it, and it'll cause fitna, because both the learned and the ignorant come, right? So there's a lot of leeway in that, particularly, and at least what many of the mashayikh mentioned in our time, especially if it's, for example, your local masjid, if people come for dhuhr, tend to be a jama'ah mahsura, right? You could easily tell them, because you know who comes, right? But if it's a large congregation, right, then trying to inform them, like let's say you prayed at the airport, how are you going to tell people? Right? You put hardship on yourself and you make it difficult for other people. Then you leave it to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? And then the next section is what are the excuses for missing the jama'ah? We'll look at that next week. Next class. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم تسليما كثيرا. And then who has more right to imama? And you'll see there's some things that some people like making fun of the Hanafis, and they just make fools of themselves. Right? And the simple thing is, if something seems strange, ask about it. Simple. They say one of the criteria is who has a more beautiful wife. One of like tertiary criteria. But it's not meant literally. This is a ta'bir. What is meant by it is who has more iffa, who has more dignified restraint. They lower their gaze more, they have their dissident, they don't talk about, they have iffa, they're restrained in terms of their dignified conduct with the opposite sex. Right? And there's other things that are equally shocking or stunning for some, but they're understood in a particular way. So we'll stop there. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. Any questions before we close?
I have a question.
Go ahead.
So we took that according to the fatwa, the validity of the Imam's prayer is according to his own madhab. So what about the validity, if we're taking that position, does the validity of the followers' prayer need to accord to their madhab or the followers' own madhab? For example, if we're praying behind a Shafi who's combining prayers for travel, do we need to recite wipe our entire period for wudu, etc.?
That's a separate issue. Like if you want to combine prayers, then when can you follow another madhab? That's not about can you pray following the madhab of the Imam. Right? If you're Hanafi, you want to combine prayers, you have to do so validly according to the other madhab. Right? If you're talib ilm, then you do it on the basis of knowledge. Find out how you combine according to the Shafi'i school. If you're ignorant, then you probably shouldn't. You're not ignorant, so that's a question. If someone's unlearned, then that's a different thing. Right? Then tawakkal ala Allah. Right? That's a separate matter. But someone who, that is clear. That when can you make taqleed of another madhab? There's basic two. بشرط أن يلتزم ولا بأس in the Durr al-Mukhtar al-Hasqafi says ولا بأس بتقليد مذهب الغير عند الضرورة. Right? Ibn Abdin says what that means is if there's some kind of haja, if there's some kind of need. But he says we've seen before in the opening of the book that تقليد الغير جائز مطلقا ولو من غير حاجة. That following another madhab is valid unconditionally, even if there isn't need, with two conditions. Right? One is بشرط صحة التقليد, on condition of valid following, such that you do the conditions and integrals according to the other school. And the second, because they mention لأن العمل الملفق باطل بالإجماع, because an action in which you combine two madhabs, and it's called talfiq, you combine two madhabs in a way that neither one madhab would deem valid, is not sound. This, unless in situations of fatwa or darura, when there's necessity or need, that's a separate issue. That's condition one. بشرط صحة الاقتداء. Second is وعدم تتبع الرخص, and you don't systematically seek out dispensations in everything. So whatever happens, you're out there fatwa shopping without need. Someone could be fatwa shopping in the sense, like seek out fatwas for everything. Someone has a medical condition, so things are difficult. So they seek how to make things valid based on, let's see what we can do to valid. But this is tatabbu' al-rukhas without need. In everything you seek out the simplest fatwa. And this, they said this because this leads to ittiba' al-hawa and tasahul fi din, and it's either in itself sinful or inevitably results in sin because you don't have restraint. And the books of taqleed discuss the parameters of that. Sidi Abdul Ghani Nabulsi in Nihayat al-Tahqiq has some very nice discussion on that. So the practical thing, the one who's learned the basics of their deen, they say follow your madhab, but if it's difficult or there's a reason, there's no harm in following another madhab, but just do it soundly. Right? So someone travels a lot, right? They travel with someone who's Shafi'i. Just learn how to make the prayer valid, the basics. What are the conditions and integrals? Just ask a Shafi'i scholar. How do I make it valid? Why did Allah create the scholars? So that we may consult them. Simple. Okay? If someone's unlearned, then the priority is to get them to learn their basics. Right? وَلَا يُشَدَّدْ عَلَى الْعَوَامِ. And the person who's not had an opportunity, we don't make things difficult. If someone asks, can I combine when I'm traveling? If you don't know how to give an answer on that, that's a fatwa. It's applying a specific ruling to a specific situation. Say, go ask a scholar. Simple. So, well, they're at the airport. What's safer for you on the Day of Judgment? To say, I don't know? Or to make up some answer and either be lax or excessive? Right? People came from Iraq to ask Imam Malik over 40 questions. 36 of them he said, I don't know. He said, we came all the way from Iraq. What do we tell our people? Say, tell them Malik doesn't know. Right? Because إعلام الموقعين عن رب العالمين. Right? Ibn al-Qayyim wrote this work on the principle of fatwa, informing those who sign off on behalf of the Lord of the worlds. When you say this is the ruling of Allah about this thing, what are you saying? That I am telling you that this is the ruling of Allah about it. If you don't have a good basis to do that, even if you're right, you're sinful. Even if you're right, you're sinful. The Prophet ﷺ said, "Man takallama fil Qur'an bi ra'yihi faqad akhta'a wa in asab." If someone speaks about the Qur'an with their own opinion, and this either in the meanings of the Qur'an, what are the ahkam? Allah, where's the ruling of prayer? It's in the Qur'an. You're telling someone you can fulfill the divine command by doing what I'm telling you. This is, you're giving a legal ruling on any human subject. It's like talk about, it's like making tafsir of the Qur'an. فَقَدْ أَخْطَأَ أي أثِمَ. One is sinful even if correct. So don't do it. One of the greatest scholars of our time, Mufti Taqi Usmani, mentions that, in some of the later years of his father's life, and his father was the Grand Mufti of Pakistan, one of the greatest scholars of the 20th century, Mufti Muhammad Shafi'. He used to take care of his father during his, when he took a nap for lunch. And at that time, Mufti Taqi Usmani had finished his alim program. And he was now doing Dawrat al-Hadith or whatever, or maybe he had started in the Ifta program, but he had not completed it. So, and frequently people would call, right? And he'd listen to the question and convey it briefly to his father and relay his answer. He'd be resting, if his father is asleep, he'd say to call him back. One day, questioner called, he took the question. His father was actually sleeping, he wasn't just napping. So he said, my father is asleep. The person really wanted an answer, so Mufti Taqi answered the question. Right? He's already finished his alim program, so he's done the hidayah. When his father woke up, he asked him. Someone called. He said, yes, who was it? So it was a questioner. He said, what did they ask about? He said, what did you tell them? He said, I told them the answer. It was the correct answer. Father got very upset. Said one of the few times in his life that his father got upset with him. Said, who told you that you can answer people's questions? Right? It's an amana. Right? And the reason people don't take the religion seriously, because the people of religion don't take the religion seriously. Like the amana. Right? Once we're driving with someone from Mufti Taqi Usmani's family in Jordan. And we have a taxi driver from our neighborhood driving us around. So we're visiting the Sahaba who are buried around Jordan. So the taxi driver said, Wallah, Shaykh Zalami Muhtarab, the Shaykh's a really respectable guy. So he borrowed a thobe from one of us. Right? So the taxi driver would normally just wear like, it's a religious guy, but just dresses regularly. He put on a thobe. But he said, Wallah, yani, I'm losing my hairline. I don't want my wife not to like it. I'm not going to wear a taqiyya. But I said, I'll keep it in my pocket though. So the Shaykh was sitting in the front, Mufti Mahmoud Ashraf Usmani. We're asking him questions. Initially, in the first leg of the ride, once in a while the taxi driver would say, Shaykhna, the way I see things, and there's the people sitting in the back, we're all like serious students of knowledge. Yeah, it was Shaykh Ahmed Snobar, Shaykh Iyad al-Ghouj, and myself. I don't think Shaykh Amjad was there, but they were pretty serious. So we were like punching the taxi driver's seat, like keep quiet, ya zalame. Right? But then he suddenly went quiet after like the first half hour. And we're just asking the Shaykh question after question. When we reached the first stop, which is Sayyidina Abu Ubaidah, radiallahu ta'ala, his maqam, we joked with the taxi driver because it's from our neighborhood. We'd always use him to drive people around. I said, like, why? Lish sakat? He says, Wallah, zalame min tiraz akhar. I said, this guy is from a different cut. Right? ما بيصير نحكي بالرأي. So we can't just give whatever opinion. There's a difference between real knowledge, just ideas. Right? So we joked with him and said, and when احنا فارغين, he said, when we're just all empty people, like you just talk with it. He said, أنتم أصحابي. So you're my friends. Right? But even a simple person can distinguish between who's a alim and just any old person. So what you see is even the ulama, what do they do? Right? People, I've been there when Shaykh Adib Kallas, one of the greatest ulama of the second half of the 20th century, someone would call him directly, ask a question. And we could hear the question. And those sitting in the dars, we could have answered the question. But he'd tell them to go to the Umawi and ask Shaykh Abdul Razak al-Halabi. Why? Because it's an amana. Right? So, right? And there's a lot of merits in saying, I don't know. Even if you know, tell them, go ask so-and-so. Because when people realize, well, there's not that many scholars around. That's good. It's good for people to be aware. There's not that many scholars around. That's very important. It's a very important realization. Right? And most Imam al-Shafi'i said, and it's based on words related from Sayyidina Ali, that if everyone who doesn't really know just kept quiet, most confusion would stop. Right? Walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Inshallah, I have another class coming up, so we have to stop here. Barakallahu ta'ala fikum. So, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala, someone was asking about the morning class. We're going to start those from next week. There's just a whole slew of things going on right now. So we'll be starting the morning lessons from next week, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. My apologies, there's just a lot going on.